So.
It's 3:33.
Oh, well, good. Okay, then I might be a minute late, or 2 or 3. But I think this is all we're going to get. So it's all on you guys. There's 4 of you, 5 of us, 6 of us. It'll be a long day. No, I'm just kidding. I did want to put up on the board a little bit about what we're talking about today. But before I do that, let's review what you watched on Tuesday. And let me just ask you some quick questions. Did Plato like rhetoric? No. I've got a 50-50 shot. Yeah. No, he didn't. Does anybody know why? I thought I said it, but I may not have in the lecture.
Well, you gave us like 4 reasons why the rhetoric is bad.
Yes. Okay. What's one of them? Do you remember?
Just like anyone can do it. People just make money off of it. And I forgot the other.
That's okay. That's good. That's good. Anybody else want to contribute? Okay. Oftentimes, he said rhetoric is used to hide the truth. So he started this whole bad reputation for rhetoric that rhetoric is just empty, flowery lies, right? And that's where he and Aristotle actually sort of split paths. Now, anybody who's written a dissertation and had a dissertation advisor knows what it feels like to be taught by one person, and by the time you're done, you really hate their guts. And you also disagree with them on some things. And I wouldn't say that Aristotle and Plato hated each other, but Aristotle definitely went away from Plato's ideas. For one thing, Plato believed that you would discover the truth, in part by practicing rhetoric. Whereas Plato said, it's kind of a lie. So let's talk about that distinction by saying this. Plato believed in dialectic. Now, not dialectical, like I said, it's dialectic. What is that? It's a process of going back and forth between 2 oppositional and usually equally matched viewpoints and looking at where they come together. Okay? Now, some people have argued, so you're talking about coming to a synthesis. No, this is not conflict negotiation. One person, one side or the other, has to win. And for Plato, he believed that the truth would always win. But Plato said the only people who could practice dialectic were philosophers. And Plato counted himself as a philosopher. So who had all the right answers? Plato. So it was kind of pointless, in a way. But the idea of sort of competing ideas, being able to produce more ideas that might be better, is a good one. So that's the practice of dialectic. When they talk about the Socratic method, they're really talking about the dialectical method. I say something to you, get you to answer a question, it comes back to me. We either modify it, or yes, or affirm it, or negate, right? That's sort of the process of dialectic. So the last time that we actually met in person, I explained that there were 3 genres of rhetoric for Aristotle, right? In other words, you had to have a reason to be practicing rhetoric. So I just wanted to remind you that those exist, because now we're going to move into where Plato and Aristotle overlap a little bit. So like I said, the process of dialectic is 2 equally but opposing forces, ideas, concepts. Most of the time, these are demonstrated through guilt and innocence in a courtroom, okay? Again, accuse and defense, right? Accusation and defense. In the middle is this point that is called stasis, or if you have Dr. Morris for this class ever, stasis. I don't care how you pronounce it, just know what it is. This point of stasis right here is a point of stability. Neither one is going to win yet. It's stable. I was raised in the 80s, so I always say it's kind of like the Cold War. Everybody knew who the enemies were. The United States versus the USSR. And both of them had mutually assured destruction two equally oppositional things that kept geopolitics stable. Does that make sense? So it's the same idea. And if you think about, well, no, we won't go that far. That point of stasis, according to Plato, is the end of things. That is where the philosopher says, okay, here's the conclusion, whatever that is. Aristotle says, no, that's where rhetoric begins. Rhetoric begins at the point of stasis because a choice must be made. Whether it's going to be this side, or some compromise in between, is where rhetoric begins. Rhetoric is where we start advocating for what is the truth. So do you remember on the first day we talked about the four paradigms? Did we talk about the post-positivists and the interpretivists and the rhetoricians? So the rhetoricians believe that you are always having to persuade people of your interpretation of the truth. Always. And that's what we're doing. Aristotle said, you pick a side and you advocate for it. Plato said, see, that's the problem. You can argue, rhetorically speaking, for both sides at the same time. You could say that something that's good is actually bad, and something that's bad is actually good. That's right. You can. So, why is rhetoric okay then? According to Aristotle, it's because you have to be a person who has goodwill towards your audience, where they believe that you're going to tell them the truth, right? So we'll get into that in a second, but he believed you must have an ethical person for it to be rhetoric. Otherwise, it's just sophistry. So Plato and Aristotle both separate themselves from the sophists, and they do it sort of in different ways, really. And it's not that Aristotle said, look, Plato, you're wrong. He said there's just more to it than just this. We can't stop here. Which does not make it ironic that Plato believed in the philosopher king, a monarchy, and Aristotle believed in democracy, right? Aristotle believed that truth gets sort of discovered through the process of rhetoric, not just dialectic. So he says that rhetoric is the counterpart to dialectic. In other words, they are equal. You must practice dialectic in order to practice rhetoric. In other words, get all the info, right? Know all sides of the argument. Know the opposition really well. You've heard this before, I'm sure. So, this is where we get Aristotle's definition of rhetoric, which of course I've said like every day, right? The art or skill of knowing in any particular instance all the means of persuasion, because he says you have to understand everything at this point about the situation in which you're practicing rhetoric. If you don't, you might miss something, and that won't work for you. So he says what you need to do, aside from just dialectical reasoning, going back and forth, is you have to have a way to develop or explain that reasoning. So we have inductive, deductive, and one you've probably never heard of, abductive. Now, have any of you ever heard of any of these? Yeah? No? Maybe? You've heard the words, you just don't know what they mean, kind of thing? Does anybody know what they mean? No. Yes? Yeah?
Well, wouldn't deductive reasoning be gathering information from, or taking something away from the information you already have to deduce something from it? And then inductive is making inferences based on the context.
It's interesting that you give that definition. I think that's the modern sort of interpretation, and that makes sense to me. Because the way Aristotle described it is a little rudimentary. So I'm going to start with there. And it's funny, because every time I watch a Sherlock Holmes show, whether it's the BBC's Sherlock, whether it's one of the movies with RDJ, whether it's Elementary, it does not matter. I'm like, you're not doing deduction, dumb nut. I'll explain that in a minute. I mean, let them have it. right? Let's actually start with deductive. Deductive is when you have a general rule or principle. You have a general rule or principle that you then apply to every situation, every instance, every example. So let's say the general, let's say the general rule is that when you're in a car, you stop on red and go on green. That applies everywhere except Springfield, Missouri, apparently. But let's just say that's the case. That means if I take someone down to the corner of Grand and National down here, that every time the light turns red, the cars would stop. And every time it turned green, they would go, right? General rule applied to each instance. Car comes up, oh, it's red, they're gonna stop. Car comes up, oh, it's green, they're gonna go, right? Inductive is literally the inverse of that. It's when you go and you sort of collect a bunch of data points, if you will, and then make a general conclusion from it. So if I went down to the corner of Grand and National and watched, and every time the light turned red, cars would, on the whole, generally stop. And when the light turned green, on the whole, they would go. And I watched each car do this from all different lanes, and I observed for a series of time, for a length of time, then I might be able to draw the conclusion, oh look, red means stop, green means go. So I've drawn a conclusion based off my experience. Making sense so far? Okay. Abductive, which is the one, you know what, most teachers aren't going to teach you this anymore, but it's what makes sense to me. So I'm going to introduce it to you so that you understand the world does not always function in a linear way, okay? Because inductive and deductive reasoning, very linear. One thing to another, right? Abductive means that instead of linearly thinking about it, you might be posed with a problem or an argument or a claim, and you go through a process of elimination of all possibilities in order to get to the conclusion. So, for example, I'm watching at the corner of Grand Avenue and National. I hope this metaphor makes sense as we go through it, okay? And I'm watching the cars. I'm watching the flow of the cars, though. And when there's a yellow light, some people speed through the intersection. And when there is sometimes a red light hanging on, they're still going through the intersection. Don't know why, but they are. And there's times when people stop on a green light, and that makes no sense, but they do it. But most of the time people are going on green and stopping on red. Yellow is a little bit questionable. So what I want to do is I want to understand what the red lights mean. What the green light, I say red lights because I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Nobody gets anywhere because we call them red lights. Traffic lights. I'm trying to figure out what the traffic lights mean, right? So what I start doing is eliminating the possible explanations, the alternative explanations. Okay, clearly you don't stop on green. You're not supposed to. If they do, they're not supposed to. Clearly you don't go on red. At least you're not supposed to. Have I seen people do it? Oh yeah, we saw people do it. But you're not supposed to, as a rule, do that. Yellow seems to require some amount of judgment. So, am I going to go on yellow or am I going to stop on yellow? That depends on where my car is located within the intersection. Am I out in the middle of it? Am I far back? Is there oncoming traffic, right? All of these different alternatives that explain how traffic lights work. And after a while, I'll be able to eliminate all of the alternatives and come to the conclusion that red means stop, green means go, and yellow means evaluate where you are and make the safest decision, right? Does that explain abductive reasoning? Okay, sweet. It's the first time that metaphor has worked for all three of them in history. I've been perfecting that thing for 18 years now. Okay. Now, the reason I bring this up, Aristotle did not introduce abductive reasoning. He focused heavily on deductive reasoning. That was his favorite. He thought that was the best way to reason with an audience, especially. The best way was to lay out the rules and then give examples, comparisons, and so on. And if you guys actually had to read the books that I originally used for this class, you would have to read 150 pages of what that is. So, first thing I'm going to say to you is, you're welcome. Second thing, because clearly you're all going, thank you for not making us read that. And oh my God, how did your previous students do it? That's always the question, right? So we read it for you. And what I could tell you is that he loved deductive reasoning because it was the easiest reasoning for your audience to understand. It is the easiest reasoning to present, right? For example, if I just walked in here and started talking about stuff, and then I said, oh, by the way, that means final conclusion. That would be confusing to you, wouldn't it? You're like, why am I listening to this list of things, or why am I hearing these examples? And then at the very end, I'm like, here's how that makes sense. I mean, it doesn't work that way real well for audiences. It might work if you're reading a book or something like that, but it doesn't work real well with audiences. He said, you need to tell them what it is you want them to know, and then give them the support for it. It's linear, it's deductive, and there's one really perfect deduction that you can make. And that is called a syllogism. I'm sure you've heard that word, yeah.
Sorry, who did you say loved deductive reasoning?
Aristotle, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So the syllogism is the perfect deductive tool. It's made up of three parts: the major premise, the minor premise, and the conclusion. The major premise is a generally agreed upon proposition. A generally agreed upon proposition. The minor premise is an application to a specific instance of that major premise.
Could you repeat that, please?
Sure,
Just the
maybe.
just the minor premise bit.
Yeah, I'm going to word it differently though. Yeah, I didn't like how that came out. See, this is the problem when you're not on TV or an actor. You don't get redos a whole heck of a lot. So I'm just going to be kind of rewind for a second and go back to it. The minor premise is a specific example or application for which you're going to use the major premise. So it's what you're going to apply the major premise to. An example, an instance, etc. I missed an E at the end of premise. I apologize. It's not spelled any differently than the premise up there. And then the last thing, the conclusion, is what you get when you apply the major premise to the minor premise. Then you can draw a conclusion. Now, does anybody know the most famous syllogism in history? No. Okay. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. So, major premise, can we all agree that all men are mortal? Yes? Can we agree that if Socrates existed, he was in fact a man? Yes? I'm just going to say yes for us. Yes. Therefore, he must also be mortal. Now, there are some problems with this. The first problem is I have no idea how this is helpful. If you know the major premise, then you know the conclusion. It's not that hard. Also, it might be valid in form, like the formula of it might be valid, but the conclusion is still invalid. For example, all cats have tails. Right? Sure, generally, we agree on that. Babette is a cat. Therefore what? All cats have tails. Babette is a cat, therefore what? Babette has a tail, which she doesn't. Now, there's multiple explanations. Now, my Babette doesn't because she was born deformed. But there's also Manx cats that don't have tails. There's cats that have lost their tails. There's cats that had damage or a sick tail and had it chopped off. There's all sorts of reasons why a cat might not have a tail that is not taken into consideration here. Does that make sense? So, two problems with the syllogism. One, you already know the conclusion, and two, it can be formally valid, and B, the conclusion can still be invalid. Okay? So then the question becomes, what the hell's the point then? Why do we still study this? And in your philosophy classes, I would ask my professor that if I took it again. I'd be like, dude, seriously, why are we studying this? All you're doing is telling me what's wrong with it. Well, in rhetoric, we have to tell you what's wrong with it in order to explain the most commonly used form of an argument. And that is an enthymeme. That's how you say that. E-N-T-H-Y-M-E-M-E. E-N-T-H-Y-M-E-M-E. Now, I'm going to do a little something let's do that special here for you. The enthymeme is the most commonly used form of argument. So what is an enthymeme? Well, if you learn from a philosophy professor, they would say that an enthymeme is just a truncated syllogism. It's a syllogism that's missing a part. And that happens a lot. For example, if I went with, all cats have tails, therefore Babette must have a tail. Right? I don't need to explain the middle part, right? If I were to come up to you and I said, hey, listen, my stomach is making some noises. I believe it's because it's empty. It's just about dinner time. Do you want to go get something to eat? No, right? I come up to you and I go, J-Chat? No? Let's go get dinner, right? It's not that hard. So the enthymeme is the most commonly used form of deduction, but of argument, according to Aristotle. Now, what is the do-dash special thing I'm about to say? You'll notice that the enthymeme ends with the word meme. That was created long after I learned all this stuff. And there is no relationship between the word enthymeme and what we call memes online. Okay? I am not claiming that one came from the other. However, if you want to understand what an enthymeme is, think about this. It is when we take part of a syllogism, a part of something, and we apply it to something else, either for to make a point or to be funny. So, give me some famous memes you know. There's two things a meme always has. It's a picture and some statement. So give me a meme. There's famous ones, guys. I don't know. They're thinking. Sorry, I was talking to the camera.
Oh, there's that little girl that's standing in front of the burning house, and she has kind of a grin on her face, and there are different little captions that people will put with it.
Okay, so the picture of the girl standing in front of a house that's on fire, and usually the thing that people put on it is, everything's just fine, right? Everything's fine. Or like the dog sitting there and everything around him is burning, and he's like, this is fine, and drinking coffee. Both of those have the same idea. The idea that everything's going wrong and we're just ignoring it, right? The house is burning down around us and we're just ignoring it. We're pretending like it's not happening. It's a statement about apathy, about not doing anything when everything's falling apart. what we have done is we've taken a major premise, which is everything's on fire, and we concluded something completely different. So sit there and drink your coffee. So smile, like it makes little sense. We take two parts of an argument, of a deductive argument, we put them together, and that makes a meme. So, when somebody asks me what an enthymeme is, I'm like, well, it's when we usually start with a generally agreed upon principle, fire, bad, right? A generally agreed upon principle, a house on fire, not good. And we take another part of a syllogism, a girl smiling, and we say this is making an argument somehow. Your job as a viewer, spectator, or listener to these things is to fill in what's missing. All right? That's your job. So, yes, it's when something is missing from the syllogism that we call that an enthymeme, but in practical usage, it's when we just assume certain things to be true or agreed upon. So, an enthymeme is an argument where one or more premises is assumed to be true or agreed upon. An enthymeme is a deductive argument, a syllogism, in which one or more of the premises are true or agreed upon. So we can look in this room and I can say to you, we've got one green wall and 3 white walls. And you might be thinking, that's not green, that's gray, that's blue. I don't know what other colors I could come up with. It's ugly, right? If I just assume we all agree that that wall is green, is that going to ruin the argument at all of whatever I'm about to say? No, it doesn't matter. So we can all generally agree that whatever color that wall is, this room is not exactly exciting. Can we go with that, right? So we assume certain premises to be true, we assume there's an agreement on it, and we move on. Almost all arguments are presented this way. Now, is that a problem? Not generally, until we start filling in the wrong assumptions, or presumptions, is what I should say. For example, they bombed us, therefore we should bomb them. What's missing?
Why did they bomb us?
There's that. Did they have a reason? Maybe that requires not retaliation, right? What else might we be missing?
What they might do in response?
Well, if they might bomb us again, right? If there might be more backlash. I always say, for me, when somebody says, they did this to us, therefore we should do this to them, I always think of the Bible and an eye for an eye, like that. And when, in 2001, when the World Trade Center had planes flown into it, the initial reaction was, we must bomb them. And we're like, who? And those of us who aren't big fans of violent war or violence generally, we're all like, wait a minute, what? No, the assumption was that everyone in America agreed, an eye for an eye. They hit you, you hit them. And unfortunately, not all of us agreed with that, right? So enthymemes can get us into real trouble with real life policy, with real life things that happen. And this is easy when we're talking about material things. But did you ever have, I'm not going to say an argument, but a discussion with someone about whether or not they really loved you or not? Not a reasoned argument, not a reasoning conversation, by the way, just so you know. And you're always on different pages about what love means, about how I feel. I always laugh at my friends who are single and they're like, look, he needs to know that I love him, and he actually does love me. He just doesn't realize it yet. And I'm always like, wait a minute, you're going to persuade a guy that he actually does love you? I don't think that's going to work out for you very well. For me, saying things like, this is the biggest mistake you're making in life. That's how I ended things. I mean, like, if you don't think the other person loves you as much as you love them, or vice versa, just say bye. It's not that hard. Don't waste your time. And in fact, the one guy that I said that to, that I was convinced I was going to be with for the rest of my life, I was like, dude, you just made the biggest mistake in your life. That guy is sitting alone in his house, working part-time, at the age of 57, and he is alone. Damn straight. Snaps. I'm just kidding. I'm not that vindictive. I mean, I kind of feel bad for the guy. But yeah, my single friends, they're all in their 50s, right? They're like, oh my God, these guys that I am being told I should date, they look so old. And I was like, yeah, that's why I got married when I was 40. We both still looked good, but we were smart enough to know better, right? And, it's always funny when people say, I'm making a really good argument for why someone should feel a certain way. Feelings probably aren't going to work. But when we're talking about material policies, things that you can see, things that you can feel, etc., the nth meme is your best friend. And by the way, if you look at any public debate, you will probably be able to realize or figure out what's missing from the arguments that people are actually disagreeing on that they don't realize they're disagreeing on. Because remember, the assumption is that we agree on certain premises, right? All right. So we need to use enthymemes if we want to make arguments to people for the purpose of persuasion. Bless you. For the purpose of persuasion. According to Aristotle, there are 3 things that you need in order to persuade. And you have to have all 3 of these, just so you know. You've probably heard them before, and you've probably heard, oh, ethos, that's credibility, or ethics. Pathos, that's emotion. Logos, that's logic. And that's about where you stop. How wrong am I?
Not very wrong.
Not very wrong. Okay. So today I'm going to tell you what these actually really mean. Is that cool? Okay. If you spend more time studying this than just in a COM 115, you learn that these are much more intricate than that. Ethos, let's start with ethos. The reason why we say, well, ethos is ethics is because, according to Aristotle, you must have both, in credibility, you must have competency, meaning that you know the subject matter really, really well and your audience can see that, and you must have character. And the most important thing is with those 2, as I said earlier, you have goodwill towards your audience. So you're a person of good character who really knows their stuff, and your audience feels you have goodwill towards them. Aristotle says if you don't have goodwill towards your audience, they're not going to listen, let alone be persuaded. And if you think about it, whenever I'm watching something and I'm like, dude, you ain't reaching me, it's usually because I don't feel like they have my best interest at heart. Does that make sense? I was asked recently to give a recommendation for a person for a job. And if this person gets said job, oh my God, it's going to be good for me. I mean, really good for me. I should really want this person to get this job for me. But I don't know that it would be good for all of my colleagues, for example, or even every professor on this university campus. I don't know that I can say that. I can only say, for me, it would be very advantageous. So if I try to convince people this person should be hired for this job, it's probably going to come off a little insincere, or selfish, because I don't know good arguments for why it would be good for the rest of the faculty. Does that make sense to you? All right, so if I don't have goodwill, I'm not going to be able to persuade. So ethos is made up of character and competence, or sometimes what we call credibility being made up of character and competence, and of course goodwill. Pathos is actually linked to the word pathetic. Now, a lot of people think when we say pathetic that we're saying weak or to be pitied or something is wrong with them or how sad, right? But pathetic just means that that thing invokes feeling. Now, I don't want to debate about that because people get mad at me when I do. I will say that the word emotion is okay, I guess. But most people just say, wow, you're really laying on the pathos here. Have you ever heard that before? Especially with a Sarah McLachlan commercial for the ASPCA, singing in the arms of the angel, and the dog's there with one eye, and the cat's there with 3 legs. And you know what? Those dogs and cats are going to be just fine. They're on TV. They're going to be okay. Someone is taking care of them, right? But they try to make them look as pathetic as possible, and by that I mean sad, for the purpose of getting people to act. In other words, for the purpose of persuading. Certain emotions are okay. Certain emotions are okay to appeal to. For example, sadness. And there are some things that go too far. For example, I don't like it when they show me commercials of children starving. Feed them. Why are you standing there with a camera? Feed them. I just want to scream at the TV. Do you really have the goodwill of the best interest of these children at heart? Or are you just looking to make a buck for recording it? Very frustrating. The one emotional appeal that Aristotle says is never okay is fear. Forcing people or trying to quote unquote persuade when you're really coercing people to action out of fear is unethical. And the last one, logos. Logos does not translate to the word logic. I know that's a shocker, but logos actually means words. And Aristotle didn't just mean use good words. That's not what he meant. What he meant was use the words that are going to demonstrate your logic the clearest. Use the language that is going to be most beneficial to you persuading this audience. And so Aristotle gives us 3 appeals that are required for persuasion. Ethos, or an appeal to goodwill. Pathos, or an appeal to your emotions. Or logos, the appeal to reason through language. Does that make sense? Those 3 things will make your persuasion successful. And that is how we get to the point of making an argument. A successful argument will start at stasis. It will have reasoning. It will appeal to all 3 of these. and then it will be successful. Questions? Aristotle's books, if you will, were, we think, handed down through oral tradition more than anything. Your book talks about it being handed down by notes, basically as his notes that he took. It's probably more likely students who took notes and then taught, and those students took notes, and then they taught, and those students took notes, and so on. However, it's not until we move into ancient Rome, which, believe it or not, we're about to do for next week. As we move into ancient Rome, isn't that exciting? We could get the hell out of Greece. That's great. We go on to Rome, and when we get there, the first theorist we're talking about is Cicero. Cicero, despite what people say, was the first one to establish the 5 canons of rhetoric. C-A-N-O-N, not C-A-N-N-O-N. Canon meaning foundational rule, okay? So he takes all of Aristotle's books or notes and he organizes it for us. And he writes what's known as really the first public speaking textbook. And it includes all of this. And today I'm going to introduce you to those 5 canons that people often attribute to Aristotle. And if I made you read all of Aristotle, you would see these 5 canons, just not in an organized fashion. Can I erase this? Yeah.
So just for clarification, this is Aristotle's thought, the 5 canons as per Cicero via Aristotle.
That is a convoluted way to put it. This is Cicero's organization of Aristotle's thoughts.
Okay.
How's that? And he does add some stuff to it, but that's not very important right now. I won't make you guys get, you all right? It's okay. These things happen. So, let me ask you this. Does anybody know what the 5 canons of rhetoric are? And no, you haven't read it yet, so I don't expect you to know, but if you've heard of them before, maybe? No. Okay. In order. In Italian. No, I won't do it in Italian. I can. Inventio, which we call invention. Arrangement. Style. Memory. And delivery. Inventio, dispositio, elocutio, memoria, actio. I just had to do it because I said I couldn't. You don't need to know the Italian, I promise. Why was it in Italian? Well, a Roman wrote these, okay? So that's how we learned them. All right. Invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery are the 5 core requirements, rules, whatever you want to call them, for rhetoric. In invention, what we're talking about is what they would call in Calm 115, choosing a topic. It's a little bit more in depth than that. Invention also includes the 3 appeals I talked to you about before. Now, those 3 appeals have a name. Some people call them the artistic proofs. Some people call them the aesthetic proofs. What that means is that they are made up by humans, right? Logos doesn't just exist in the world. Ethos doesn't just exist in the world. You have to create those things. In artificial or in artistic proofs is the opposite of that. It's the things that you can see, smell, taste, science, if you will. Deduction of a material item. So if I say this table is solid, that's inartificial, right? That didn't have to be created. We labeled this feeling as solid. It's not hollow, therefore it's solid, right? But if I told you, man, this table is the worst table in history. It is too thin. It is not as stable as I would like because it's on wheels, right? I have to make the argument up for you. You don't look at this table and say, that's the worst table I've ever seen. That doesn't happen. I have to make it up. So artificial proofs created by the speaker. Those are included here in invention. So ethos, logos, and pathos are included in invention. And the reason why is because invention is not just what am I going to talk about or what's my topic. It's what is entailed in this topic and what proofs inartistic and artistic am I going to need for this speech. So remember when you had to give a how-to speech or something like that, an informational speech, and you decided that you were going to do how to make grilled cheese or something like that. I don't know what you guys decided to do, but back in my day, how to make grilled cheese with an iron was a popular one. I had somebody when I was teaching at Mizzou do their informational speech on how to use Febreze. Yeah, because that's a challenge. You spray it. So invention is taking into consideration what artificial and inartificial proofs are at my disposal. And then you know the scope of your topic as well. All of that goes into the simple process of choosing a topic. I love when books just do that. We torture you guys in 115. I know it. Arrangement. You were probably taught arrangement in terms of organizational patterns, right? Organization, very important. No, it's more than that. It is about not just being organized. It's about how you're going to arrange your arguments in order for it to be the most persuasive. How are you going to arrange the arguments in order for it to be most persuasive? Dispositio being the Italian for this, or disposition, which is another way of saying placement. Where am I placing which arguments in order to be persuasive? Style. According to Cicero, you're going to read that there are 3 levels of style. No more, no less. You don't get to go, that's just my style. Like my 15-year-old bonus daughter does whenever I say, why in God's name are you wearing those shoes with that skirt? It's just my style. And when I started teaching back in 1997, I used to have students who would deliver a speech, and I'm grading them because I taught intro to speech, because we all do, and they didn't like their grade. And I'm like, why? Here's some problems, your style was like this. And they're like, well, that's just my style. I should be allowed to speak in my style. No, you shouldn't. You should be required to learn how to speak in a style that's going to make the most sense to be persuasive to your audience, okay? And so we'll talk about those 3 levels of style next week. Memory does not mean you need to memorize your speech, bless you. Memory comes from the oral tradition. So way back, before we had newspapers and, God forbid, any kind of media, how did news get spread? How did people find out that George Washington was the president? Well, the way it happened was there would be people sent out to tell audiences, here's who is the president and why. And then those people might go out and deliver a speech saying, here's who the president is and why. And that's how news traveled. In ancient times, it was the same thing. A senator would give a speech, right? And then the citizens who were in the Senate would go out and spread that. And being able to practice rhetoric means understanding the main ideas and evidence of an argument and being able to re-deliver that to an audience, to another audience, a new audience. But here's the trick. You don't need to memorize that word for word. What you need to do is make sure that the main ideas in the right tone gets to the next audience. And that's what Memoria is. I might give you a completely different speech the second time around on this with the same exact evidence and the same exact topics. Same argument. Right? Does that make sense to you? Finally, delivery. It's at the bottom of the 5 here. Aristotle and Cicero would argue that this is the order in which these should be made. There's some disagreement on style and memory, I'll be honest with you, but you don't need to worry about that. That's for us nerds to figure out. Delivery is always at the bottom, and people are like, oh, that means it's the least important. Look, I cannot say this enough. These are the 5 canons. If you're missing any of these or you're bad at one of these, you don't have a good speech. You are not practicing rhetoric well. Does that make sense to you? And the reason that delivery is at the bottom, so to speak, is because if you don't have something important to say and you don't know how to arrange it for the audience to make it understandable, and you don't know how to speak to your audience because you don't know what they need to hear, then what do you have to deliver? So if you're missing any one of these top 4, your delivery is irrelevant. However, most people, when they practice rhetoric, we evaluate all of these things. When I started teaching at Miami of Ohio, I had 2 students who gave speeches, and, well, I had many students, but 2 of them that I'm thinking about right now. And one of them was a really interesting speaker, had a great style, lots of eye contact, movement, amazing. He said absolutely nothing for 7 minutes. Then I had another person who had really good evidence that was on these cards that was really small print, and the arguments really made a lot of sense, I think, but it was delivered like shit. They both got the same exact grade. Because by the time I evaluated it, and the kid who's the great speaker came into my office hours and was like, you can't give me the same grade you gave so-and-so. I'm like, number 1, why are you comparing grades? That's dumb. But number 2, why can't I? You deliver. He goes, my delivery was better than anybody else. I said, agreed. Sadly, you didn't say anything. There was no content. You know what? It was like you gave me a motivational speech. Great, but that wasn't the assignment, right? You got me really inspired to do something. I just don't know what that is, right? So these 5 are key to practicing rhetoric. They are explained by Cicero in this order and organized for us in the first public speaking textbook by Cicero, all based on Aristotle's philosophy of rhetoric. Make sense? Questions, comments, concerns, complaints? They say no. Okay, then I will end it here. Have fun reading the Romans, well, reading Cicero for next time, I guess. And did you guys notice I did get the page numbers, I think, correct now?
Oh, got the email.
You got the email.
I double checked it.
Okay, well, that's okay. I just wanted you guys to know. I don't know what book I was going off of that you guys weren't, but clearly my book was bigger. Let's just put it that way. But hopefully it's fixed now.